Data Analytics, Exploring Data with Pivot Tables. Introduction. You can do extensive data analysis using pivot tables and produce desired reports. The integration of data model with pivot table enhances the way the data is collated, connected, summarized, and reported. You can import tables from external data sources and create a pivot table with imported tables. This facilitates automatic updations of the values in the pivot table whenever the data in the connected data source is updated. Creating a pivot table to analyze external data. To create a pivot table to analyze external data, open a new blank workbook in Excel. Click the Data tab on the ribbon. So this is the Data tab. Then click from Access in the Get External Data group. So from Access, the Select Data Source dialog box appears. Select the Access database. Click the Open button. The Select Table dialog box appears, displaying the tables in the database. Access database is a relational database and the tables will be similar to Excel tables, with the exception that relationships exist among those tables. Check the box Enable Selection to Multiple Tables, then select all tables and then click OK. So here we enable selection of multiple tables, then we click OK. So we check all tables, then we click OK. The Import Data dialog box appears. So this is the Import dialog box. Select Pivot Table Report. This option imports the tables into your Excel workbook and creates a pivot table for analyzing the imported tables. So we choose pivot table. Then where do you want to put the data? So we can place here where we want to put the data. And this one is automatic. As you observe, the checkbox Add this data to the data model is selected and disabled, indicating that the tables will be added to the data model automatically. The data will be imported and an empty pivot table will be created. So this is now our empty pivot table. The imported tables appear in the pivot table field list. So these are the field lists. Exploring data in multiple tables. You can analyze the data from the imported multiple tables with pivot table and arrive at a specific report you want in just few steps. This is possible because of the pre-existing relationships among the tables in the source database. So there's already a pre-existing relationships. As you imported all the tables from the database together at the same time, Excel recreates the relationships in its data model. So again, the relationship was already created by Excel in the data model. In the pivot table fields list, you will find all the table that you imported and the fields in each of them. If the fields are not visible for any table, click on the arrow next to that table in the pivot table field list, and the field list in that table will be displayed. Exploring data using pivot table. You know how to add fields to pivot table and drag fields across areas. Even if you are not sure of the final report that you want, you can play with the data and choose the appropriate report. Suppose you want to have a report displaying the following: data for 5 disciplines: archery, diving, fencing, figure skating, and speed skating. Regions that scored more than 80 medals in these 5 disciplines. The count of 5 medals in each of the 5 disciplines in each of these regions, and total count of medals for the 5 disciplines in each of these regions. You can see how easily you can create this report in few steps. We start with create a pivot table displaying the count of medals in all regions for the selected 5 disciplines as follows. Drag the NOC country region field from the medals tables to the columns area. Then drag the discipline from the disciplines table to the rows area. Then filter discipline to display only the 5 disciplines for which you wanted the report. This can be done either in the PivotTable Fields area or from the row labels filter in the PivotTable itself. Drag medals from the medals tables to the values area. Drag medal from medals table to the filters area. So this will be the appearance. So we have here the countries. And these are the disciplines, and then we have here the values. So as you observe, count of medals is displayed for all the regions. So all the regions here. And for the 5 disciplines that you selected. Next, you have to fine-tune this report so that only those regions with total count of medals greater than 80 will be displayed. So click the arrow button to the right of column labels. So these are the column labels. Then select greater than from the drop-down list that appears. So column labels, click on the arrow. Then the drop down appears. So we have here, click on values filter. So values filter dialog box appears. And then as you observe, so here we place count of medals is greater than 80, I believe. So as you observe, count of medals is greater than are displayed on the box says below. Show items for which, so this one. Then type 80 in the box next to the box containing is greater than. So count of medals is greater than 80, and then we click OK. So now the pivot table displays only those regions with total count of medals in the selected 5 disciplines greater than 80. So notice the totals here are all greater than 80. So we have here now our pivot table with the desired result. Creating a relationship between tables with PivotTable Fields. If you do not import the tables at the same time, and if the data is from different sources, or if you add new tables to your workbook, you have to create the relationships among the tables by yourself. Add a new worksheet with a table that contains sport and sport ID fields to your workbook. So we have this table. In a new worksheet, name the table sports. So the name of the table is sports, and click all the pivot table fields list in the pivot table worksheet. So all. Then we have here the new table. You can see that the newly added table sports is also visible in the pivot table field list. Next, add the field sport also to the pivot table as follows. So drag the field sport from the table sports to rows area, and the sport values appear as row labels in the pivot table. A message will appear in the pivot table fields list that relationship between tables may be needed. A create button appears next to the message. So when we drag this, it says here, message to create relationship between tables. So relationship between tables may be needed. So we have here the create button. Click the create button. Then the create relationship dialog box appears. So this one. So this is the create relationship dialog box. Select medals under table. So medals. That's the name of the table. Select sport under column. Then related table sports, and then sports. So these are the fields that will be related. Drag discipline under sports in rows. And this is to define the hierarchy in the pivot table. The pivot table displays the sport corresponding group of disciplines for that sport. So we have here the sport and the event. Sport and the disciplines rather. So pivot table with new relationship and rows order for proper hierarchy. So we have sport and discipline. Okay, so that ends the lecture on exploring data using the pivot table. Thank you very much for viewing this video.